topic of his talk is, it's really directly related. It's a continuation. Yes?
Part two.
Yeah, directly related, at least in part. And the title of his talk is Kukai's Bunkyo.
Good luck.
That's the title, yes, what we were talking about. What Victor was talking about. Kukai's Bunkyo hifuron and Traces of Dandin in East Asia. Can you?
Yeah.
New one.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Yigao, David, and also Charlie, who is my teacher, and also the Institute of Advanced Studies for making me a core member of the Dandin research group. I'm very happy that I'm taking off from where Victor has left. So this is almost part two. And also, I would like to go into some of the details. So a lot of the things that, I think I probably just don't need to talk about anymore. So like you already have the framework of where I'm going to speak about. And so obviously, my starting point is Mayer and May, this article, which we've been talking about in the last session. My talk is going to be divided basically into two parts. The first part is going to be addressing the evidence which is already mentioned in the article by Mayer and May. But then there's a slightly different look, a new consideration of the evidence which is presented there. For large parts, whatever connection is made, they should take credit for it. And then in the second part, I'm also going into basically other parts of Bunkyo hifuron. There's some new evidence which I want to present. So then it's kind of a combined evidence in that sense. So then for the second part, I guess they should also get credit for bringing up the Kukai connection. I think I don't need to really speak too much about Kukai and the work itself. So basically, it's a collection of works on poetics, not all of it, but a lot of the works on poetics, which are already lost in China. It's only preserved. Some of them have modern surviving editions in China, but there are a lot of works on poetics. So then suddenly have this cache of text on poetics, and it's the right time to look at basically, what exactly is the possible connection influence there is. I would say, for looking at the evidence which Mayer and May have presented, I think my conclusion or my attitude is perhaps more conservative. I think I wouldn't say anything like without doubt. But we'll see towards the end of the talk. You are the judge. In terms of how strong the evidence is, right? Then going back to what they have done, I think one of the issues is the focus of their essay is really on prosody. So I'm not going to talk too much about prosody, and also there's a question about time. So then the phenomenon of the invention of recent style prosody in the article is really an event which occurred for the most part in the 5th and 6th centuries. So that wouldn't fit into the influence of Dandin question too much. But then the article itself has presented a lot of evidence, possible connections. So those are the things. So like taking the question of Dandin in mind, and that's what we're going to look at, exactly how these evidence would work. So there are two factors which I want to bring into the consideration of this issue. First is time, right? So that's important. And In terms of time, we had to look at in two regions. In India, looking at these works on poetics. I'm not going to focus too much on Natya Shastra. It's very old. The basic point of reference for me on the Indian side is going to be Bhamaha. And then, of course, for the dates of these two authors, Bhamaha and Dandin, I'm pretty much based myself on the previous scholarship. So then, tentatively, let's say Dandin is around 700, and then Bhamaha could be earlier. It's a question. I guess it's an issue that needs to be decided. So then, let's just say, taking the consensus, perhaps it could be sometime in the early half of the 7th century. So I am accepting the view that Li Gao has presented in our article on the chronology. So Bhamaha is prior in time, and Dandin comes later. And then how does it work? How does the Chinese chronology correlate with what we have seen on the Indian side? So here what we need to do is to take a look at basically the different kinds of texts which are preserved. And then this is actually a major topic in Japanese and Chinese research on what are the sources of Kukai. So it's basically an anthology of works on poetics. So then there's a lot of scholarship. So I need to say, to apologize, I guess in the beginning I haven't really turned to the Chinese connection until maybe about a few weeks ago with full attention. So I guess there's much more that can be done. So here I'm kind of relying on the scholarship which has already been done on what texts there are and what's the date, right? So let's take a look at these sources. There are some of them which are anonymous. Those, I guess, we cannot really say too much. There is Wen Bi Shi, and then there's also Shi Ti. So then not too much we can say. And then Lu Ji's Wen Fu. This is a very early, it's like a statement on literature, and also the style is very different from the rest of it. So I don't think really in the materials that we're considering, it's really not very relevant. And then coming after that, so this is in the southern and northern dynasties, and for Marian May article, it's very important. That's the period they're looking at. So then Shenghai, and these are basically the theory really concerns the tonal features of Chinese language, and also tonal prosody, right? So then I think for us it's not too relevant, but just to know that that's the emphasis, tones and tonal prosody. That's the emphasis of it. So it's not going to be too relevant for us. And then there's also in the subsequent Sui and also early Tang dynasty another work. Perhaps some of the materials is also on tonal prosody. But then it seems that this work is also relatively early, so we don't really need to consider the others too carefully. So then for us, the important works are really two periods. One, so first of all, Kukai wrote the text. The materials that he received is from the early 9th century, right? So then, these are different kinds of authors that the books that he collected. So the first period, sources which could be relevant to the possible influence of Bhamaha is between 650 and 700. So we have a list of those texts. Not all of them are relevant. For instance, Yuanjing, the ones that are that we actually see a lot, for instance, in the section on defect, Yuanjing is cited very frequently, and Cuirong also. So here there is a possibility of Bhamaha's influence. But then if you really want to have Dandin, you say that this is really from Dandin. The preferred sources you want to find is really in the last section. So those are the ones which comes after the 700. There's Yingfan, that's not too important. And then Wang Changling, Shige, finally Jiaoran. Jiaoran is a monk who also considered as one of the best Tang monk poet, and also is a theoretician, has written work on poetics. So this is very interesting. I want to explore more, but just for the time being, I haven't had a chance to. But just looking through these texts through Kukai's Bunkyo hifuron. So that's the framework. So in other words, when we look at these sources, one of the impression we already get is Dandin is at a disadvantage. Because if there are texts which evidence that shows up in the earlier sources, then Bamaha has an advantage and Dandin has a disadvantage, right? So then that's the first consideration in terms of time. The second consideration I want to talk about is also to think about how strong the evidence is, to think about that question. So then here I provided at least some of the ways in which I think about the types of evidence. The strong ones, first and foremost, is resemblance in substance. They should be talking about the same thing. And second, borrowing of textual materials, for instance, the example verses look familiar. There are elements of that that look familiar. That's a plus. But I think not too strong though, unless it's very unique. So just put that there as well. I think it's an added element. If there are additional resemblance, then it's a good evidence. Significant likelihood of imitation. Here, then I think it's something like. If a Chinese author, a Chinese writer is looking at the Indian figure, whatever it is, and looking at it and then could perhaps what comes up, what is invented in China is not exactly the same thing, but where you could see that there is a possibility that he wants to imitate that, and then the form adopted is a Chinese one. So that's what I mean by significant likelihood of imitation. Finally, similarity in name. This is not what I emphasize. I feel it's only strong if the name is very unique. Say if there's a figure which is called a monkey holding a trumpet and sitting on an elephant which is climbing a tree, in both Dandin and also in China, then we can prove that someone is already reading Dandin. There's no question. So it has to be very unique, right? And then finally, if there is a pattern of repetition, if there are multiple instances of possible influence, that's what makes it strong, right? So that's the strong evidence. And then weak ones, what are the weak ones? Things which belong to the same category. So you can classify two things, Chinese and Sanskrit, and put them in the same category. They're not the same thing, but they somehow fit into the same category. So that's a possibility. You could say that there's a possibility of likelihood of imitation, but then it's not very, very strong. Basically, they're not the same thing. It's not resemblance in substance. Finally, if it's only similarity in name, then also it's not strong. I think it's not strong. That's my opinion. Okay. I think we've already heard that there is a correspondence between dosha and being. That's the first part of my my speech. And then the second part is, that's what I want to focus on. It's a section on Chinese patterns of repetition which look like Indian yarmakas. And then here, I guess there are different kinds of influences you could think about. One is the practice of poetry. In the writing of poems themselves that you can detect possible influence. And then there's also theoretical framing. In other words, you could say something like, all of these poems are Chinese poems, but then there's a certain way of Sanskrit Shastric way of organizing them that is similar to the way in which the Chinese treatises on poetics is organizing these. So that's a possibility. So we could have a situation where there is no influence on the practice, but then an influence on the theoretical framing, right? And then there's also methods. I guess that has already been talked about in the last session. For instance, the procedurals, giving definition, giving examples, so on and so forth. And in that regard, I think Kukai actually has a strong, there's resemblance there. Okay. All right, so now we come to the first section, which is dosha and bing. And here I've given you a complete list of 30 Chinese bing. But then here what I'm trying to do is to put them into categories so that we can look at the types of influence, where did the influence come from. The first category, all of them, the name look very exotic, have to do with tonal porosity. And here I made a judgment. I think I'm not going to go into this in detail. I think in Mayer and May's article, the argument is that these are, the specific rules are based on Yamaka. And then, in my view, this is a case of, I think the strongest similarity is really in name, I feel. So I think on this issue, I would disagree with, on how strong the evidence is. I think I would disagree. So let's just, keep in mind that I'm reading their essay, but then I have my own interpretation. So then the other issue is the way in which I organize these categories is also not the way that they would, arrange these issues. So I guess we could talk about that. So just, I think we have to bear this in mind. So then what we have is, first of all, a very long list of rules concerning tonal porosity. And then we know Shenghai, it came up in the last talk, that he came up with this list of 8 rules that's in this category. And then you can see a lot of them in my interpretation, which are rules concerning porosity, which you can see that these are the proliferations of earlier rules on porosity. So then I put that as a category. That's not where I see the strongest evidence is. And then the second category is something which is called parallelism. So I think here then we're going to sort of the details of Chinese poetry. Here we have, in terms of the form itself, it has the use of tonal porosity, and then there's parallelism. On page 4, I think, of the handouts, I provided just a little something on parallelism. Basically, what it is the practice of symmetry. So it requires, the practice of parallelism is something which requires that the two lines, the two padas of a couplet should mirror each other. So then syntactically they should follow the same pattern, and noun parallels with noun, verb with verb, and even with noun, perhaps things that belong to the same category, spring is paralleled by autumn, so on and so forth. Sometimes it's similarity and sometimes it's contrast. So then very quickly I want to just mention that because this will come up later. And what I think these rules, so this has the issue looking at the names of the being and also looking at all the examples, the interpretations. That's what I came up with. I think that's how I think of how you put these categories, these types of beings into categories. So 11, I think it's basically the general rule of general injunction of parallelism. Second, disjointed. Also, I put it there. I think here there's a possibility of different kinds of interpretation. And then we have a list of 3 more. Here, I thought that these 3 categories, 3 items, actually also has to. It's like it grows out of this this context of doing parallelism. So then there's a question of structural monotony. And also in vocabulary. So I think I put those in the same category as parallelism. So all of these are parallelism. So prosody, parallelism. And up to this point, I think you get a picture that the Chinese concept of being, literary defect, is not exactly the same as the Sanskrit dosha. It's more encompassing. It has prosody in it. And also has the practice of this thing called parallelism. I don't know how to characterize it, but then it has to. Those are the things which concern basically the formal features of this literary form of shi, right? And this is not a place where I see the strongest influence is the correspondence. So then. I think Mayer and May's article, in their article, there are more correspondences that are proposed. So then you could see more correspondence there. So, but a decision which I have made is to present what I think is the strongest argument you can make, to focus on the strongest areas of possible influence. And after that, and this is the place where I see the strong possibility of influence comes from. So here we get a section on basically meaning. We have 4 items, 12, 22. It's going so fast, and I don't want to present all of this on this. So here, there's 3 kinds of things. One, on basically, these are rules against tautology. And then 23, out of season Kala Virodi corresponds to Kala Virodi, and the first 4 correspond to the Sanskrit Eka Artha tautology in the Sanskrit literature. And finally, 26 is contradiction and corresponds to the Sanskrit Vyata. And there are very specific areas in which, especially in Eka Artha and Kala Virodi, I think I don't have enough time, so I'll just leave it to you to look at. There's a later section after the table, I think, where I provided to you even possible areas of textual borrowing. So the texts actually resemble each other, but then these resemblances is not unique. So like I think there are some of them, some echoes, the text like resembling each other. And so that's in Eka Artha and Kala Virodi. And the third is contradiction. And that is, I think it's similarity, resemblance in substance, but not in the areas of textual borrowing. So here we have a section of doshas that concern meaning. So that's interesting. You think about the idea of Chinese being. It has prosody, has parallelism, and then it grows into the area of meaning, right? And finally, there's certain conventions of propriety, and the Chinese examples all concern things like you should not say something against the king, the state, or your parents. So they're somewhat different. The Sanskrit, there are some of them Artha Dushta in Bhamaha, and in the case of Dandin, Gramyata. All of them, it's a different kind of lack of propriety. It has to do with sexual connotation. Most of them have that connotation. So the substance is different. The Chinese case is political royalty to the king, filial piety, but in the Sanskrit case they're different. But they belong to the same category of convention of propriety. And then the third is miscellaneous. I'm not going to talk about this. And so the interesting thing is you could say that in the category of convention of propriety, that's where I see medium degree of resemblance. But then the strongest is really in the category of artha. And it kind of makes sense because when you go to the Sanskrit concept of dosha, a lot of them is artha. Say, if we go to Natya Shastra's 10 doshas, you have 5 of them are concerning artha. There's Gudartha, Artha Antara, Artha Hina, and then Binna Artha, Eka Artha. So there are 5 out of 10. Then you go to Bhamaha, he has multiple lists of artha. There's one which appear in the earlier part of the book, list of 10 there. You have Neyartha, Anya Artha, Artha Dushta, right? And then there's a list of arthas that are shared by Dandin and Bhamaha. It's a list of 10, and out of the 10 you have 4. So Appa Artha, Vyartha, Eka Artha, Sasanshaya is also another one that concerns artha. So you could say that something like that. So Indian concept of dosha has a predominance, a strong focus on meaning. And then here, Chinese, Strengyue's focus on prosodies earlier, but then you go to the later time, so there's a switch, there's expansion, right, into the area of artha. So that's a case I think we can make. And maybe also the convention of propriety also is a median degree of influence. So I think I characterize my own consideration of the evidence as like less optimistic, but I still feel, here there is actually an area of possible influence. So then what kind of objection you can make, you can make to this kind of evidence? One is you could say, well, this doesn't really influence the practice of poetry. So tautology, contradiction, gala virod, everyone knows. Why would we want to have this kind of dosha? It seems like it's useless. But then another point in answer to that could be something like, well, being defect is a native indigenous concept. So if a Chinese poet has a chance to talk to an Indian visitor who knows poetics, they want to bring up this concept. What do you know about being? And then new ideas of being could be learned from that kind of conversation, even though it's another issue. I guess you could say that it's pedestrian, but I think at least there is evidence there. So if that's pedestrian, but I think the next section of similarities and resemblances is not pedestrian. It's interesting. I mean, these are quite unique features. But again, I would say, I'll talk about. I don't know, maybe running out of time. Again, I think in conclusion, I would say, at the end of the second set of evidence, I would say that it's not in the influence of the practice of poetry. It's not that. It's the shastric framing of things, things that already existed in China, that becomes, if there's influence, the ways in which it becomes framed. So then here we have Yamaka. I guess I got lost one here. Okay. All right. So here, I want to focus on this. It's an unusual place to find it. It's really on the section on the practice of parallelism. There's a section of a list of 28 kinds of parallelism. Andrew over there has written about parallelism. And there I found there's a set of those parallelisms that actually show patterns of yamaka. So then, first of all, we want to think about exactly what it is, yamaka, yamaka in Chinese. So what I want to present here is that the Chinese equivalent of yamaka is repetition of character. The same character is repeated. And that's what I think is the closest Chinese equivalent. But then if you look at the Chinese repetition of character, from the Indian point of view, you wouldn't say that this is yamaka. So it's the repetition of a single character, a single syllable, right? In the Indian case, these are alliteration probably. It's not yamaka. But then we have to bear in mind here the fact that Chinese, is still predominantly perhaps monosyllabic. So one syllable is a word. So corresponding to multiple syllables in Sanskrit, right? And the other point that I want to make here is that you actually see patterns of yamaka here with this kind of repetition. And then in terms of this pattern of repetition in Chinese, there's also different kinds. There is alliteration of consonant, and then there's also internal rhyming. External rhyming is a feature of the regulated verse itself, just verse making in general itself. But then these are additional kinds of rhyming, internal rhyming. But there, even in Sanskrit, really, there's no, in Dandin at least, there's no discussion of patterns. There's no such things. It's really in yamaka that the repetition of the pattern of yamaka is discussed, right? Okay, so here what I want to present here is that there is a set of at least 5 kinds of parallelism. Just read it: parallelism with alternate line, double pointing parallel, parallel of joint bouquet. Chinese names are always kind of interesting. And then parallel in the style of rhyme prose. I'll comment on the word rhyme prose later. And then parallel in the form of revolving text. So presenting them in the order in which I want to. The first is parallel in the style of rhyme prose. Rhyme prose is a form of Chinese literature, which was in practice in Han Dynasty. That's from 2nd BCE to the 2nd CE. So it's a very long time ago. So those type of things are done long before there's a possible Indian influence. So first example I want to give you, this is an example we will come back to. What you see here is this repetition. I'll read the verse itself. 袅袅树惊风，晒晒云蔽月. So we have 袅袅 and 晒晒. So remember here we're doing in the context of Chinese parallelism. So if there is a repetition in the first pada, using the English, the Sanskrit vocabulary, then in the second pada in the same location you also have the repetition, right? So translation, I also provide a diagram of what this looked like. And translation, all my stuff is messed up. As it shakes, the tree startles the wind. And then the second line, as it shines, the moon is covered by clouds. So then, interesting idea. We'll come back to this later. So first of all, at least what we can see here is a pattern of repetition, right? And then in the description of this type of parallelism, you can actually find this kind of vocabulary, and it's even exemplified. So in the description you find in the beginning of the line, Kukai would say this kind of repetition comes in the beginning of the line, in the middle of the line, at the end of the line. It could be repetition of a character, but also other kinds of alliteration. So that's something which we want to keep in mind, right? In the beginning, middle, and end, adi, madhya, anta. So that kind of vocabulary you can see. And going forward to the next one, which is the joined brocade, the parallel of joined brocade. Here it's a little different. In the first case of parallel, it's really a lot of them are actually words themselves that are consisting of two syllables. So words themselves have two syllables, and they are the same character, which is repeated. But then in the second case, sometimes they actually function with different kind of grammatical function. I'm only providing the pattern. So you have two things which is repeated in the second and the third syllable. And then the second syllable would be an object of the verb that comes in the first place. And then the third syllable would be the subject. So there's a difference. If you translate this into Sanskrit, then it's not yamaka anymore. It's bava tam bava do, something like that. But then in Chinese, it's the same. There's no inflection. So the same kind of. But the most interesting thing that you find here is he made this comment. He said, as for the parallel of joined brocade, it is not interrupted, right? That's important, not interrupted. Avyapeta, it translates into Sanskrit. We'll come back to this point. So there are all these little things which corresponds to Sanskrit stuff. And the third kinds I want to present here is something which is called double pointing parallel. So there is patterns of repetition that is not interrupted. Therefore, there's also ones that's interrupted, and that's what the next one is. So 一月没七月润花夹胜华. So there's a translation. Should you think about moon, her eyebrow puts moon to shame. Should you mention the flower, her cheeks surpass flower. So moon, flower is repeated. And there is a gap in between, so it's a via beta, right? If you think about the Sanskrit equivalent. And then the next one, I'm not going to talk about this. It's just it occurs in the context of parallel with alternate lines. So then there are parallelism not within a couplet. So the first would be parallel with the third, and fourth with the second with fourth. Therefore, if you do more different kinds of interrupted and not interrupted, then it provides more types of, more patterns of repetition. So then certainly, you can think about in Dandin various kinds of repetition via beta combined, this kind of pattern. Then going to the next, the next two are quite unique, I think. The next one I call parallelism in the form of Patiloma Yamaka, and it actually occurs in the Futi Dui, the parallel in the form of what is it again, rhyme prose. And there it's interesting. So Kukai first introduced this poem where the repetition comes in the beginning of the line. And then a few examples later, so first there's a repetition in the beginning, and in the middle, and at the end. And then in the end, what's the example for that? He just like reverse the verse and read the verse backwards, and then becomes, and it's like it makes sense. The interesting thing is it does make sense because when the wind is blowing on the tree, it startles. The wind is bringing like gently, and then makes the tree is shaking in the wind. Then it's not the wind. The wind. It's really the tree that startles the wind, right? That's one thing. And then you have the cloud, which is covering the moon. But then when you reverse that, it has a different meaning. So it's the moon which is concealing the cloud because it's shining so brightly. The cloud becomes invisible. And then in the case of startling, it's the wind which startles the tree. So both of them works. And the other interesting thing is this word niao niao. It has two different meanings. One is the shaking of a tree, but also means a wind which is blowing gently. So it's like it goes with two different things. There's a kind of, what do you call that, a shleisha in it. So it works well. And then you also have the next one, which is, I've given the Patiloma Yamaka example in Kavyadasha. And then the next one, you have something which is called in Chinese, it's Hui Wen Dui, parallel in the form of revolving text. And this is basically the pattern of, in Sanskrit, Sandashta Yamaka. So it starts with an A, go to a pada starts with A and ends with B. The next pada starts with B and ends with C, right? And then so on and so forth. I've given the pattern of Sandashta Yamaka. The Chinese kind of interesting. So it's 情情有得意，得意遂情情，心情终会故，会故亦尽心。I'll read the translation. Love turns intimate on the account of fulfillment. Fulfillment leads to the intimate feeling of love. New love eventually becomes old, and when it becomes old, one also experiences something new. Third and fourth, you can make sense. I kind of I'm struggling with the first two. It seems like it's incurring this dosha of ek ata in Chinese. It seems to be saying the same thing. But anyway, but at least it works. But then also you can see that there is other elements which is playing in the Chinese. It's a circle, right? It's a loop going from the first line to the second, and then it comes back. So there's a loop, and the third and the fourth there's a loop there, but then there's a connection. You could say that the qing is repeated there. So it's like in one way you can think about it is the first and second line is a loop, but then the third also continues to the next. And there are also various kinds of alliteration that happens here. I provided in the notes there. And so in addition to Sandashta, you can also think about in Kavyadasha this example of Sansushti Yamaka, which first of all, it has element of, provided the diagram of this. So first of all, it has the element of Sandashta, this revolving kind of pattern. But then inside there's also repetition in the form of interrupted and not interrupted. So then it's like it resembles not just to Sandashta, but also this Sansurshti example in Dandin, right? So to summarize, what kind of patterns of repetition we see in the Chinese? First of all, there is the organizing principle that you could do the repetition in the beginning, middle, and end of a pada. I'm using the Sanskrit terminology. and repetition that are separated, and then also not separated, of course, via beta, right? And then there are complex, the combination of that produces a lot of, in this alternate parallel that I mentioned, there are more complex patterns you can do. And then there's some Dashta patterns and then Patiloma patterns, right? So those are a range of I'm sorry. Can I just try to finish very quickly? And so what's the conclusion? I guess, first of all, when you look at this list of types of repetition, and then compare that with Dandin and Yamaka, I'm sorry, Bamaha, well, here then you can see, in the case of dosha, Bamaha actually has more correspondence. But then here you can see that Dandin has more correspondence here. It covers more range of stuff that's in Dandin. But then what is not in Bamaha? Bamaha doesn't have. Bamaha mentions some Dashta type. You mentioned no example for that. There's no Patiloma, right? Also, he doesn't say specifically via beta. So those are the elements which are missing, right? So Dandin now eventually has an upper hand in the possible influence, and but then I think finally I want to talk about the time, the chronology, Sanskrit and Chinese are put together, and then here again, then you could say that there's that's where Dandin's disadvantage comes from. It's really when you look at these possible dosha equivalents of being, and also these Yamaka patterns. In both cases, actually, there are sources, Chinese sources, which occur between 650 and 700. So if you say there is a possible influence, actually Bamaha has the upper hand. And then when you, again, going back to think about the case of Yamaka patterns, and you think about this again, Bamaha actually has a very short list of Yamaka. There are 7 of them. So then, for one thing, the Chinese Patiloma is almost done by accident. And if you eliminate that, there is a via beta. It's not mentioned, but then those kind of things probably exist. And then the third, what is it again? Some Dashta is not exemplified, but it's only mentioned. So it's kind of interesting thing. Bamaha's correspondence, you would say that these types of repetition patterns actually covers the range of Bamaha's Yamaka patterns better than it covers Dandin's. So I think it's mainly really in the time, when you consider the issue of time, it seems Bamaha has the upper hand. So then that's the evidence I want to present. I still think that the Futi, Dui, the parallel in the form of rhyme prose, and also that's a practice which occurred a long time ago. And then also in the case of this Samdashta type of Yamaka, there are very early Chinese examples. So I would say probably most of these patterns of repetition have occurred before. So it's not influencing the practice, but then there's a possibility in the influence of the organizing of knowledge. So someone who has, say, this Kavya Dasha verse, which I presented here, if someone just heard that, they could have used this kind of knowledge or the range of Yamakas to organize stuff. So that's the second part of the presentation. So the two things joined together, both of them moderate kinds of evidence, but then it's strengthened by combining them together. So Yigao has said perhaps Dandin is in China, and Victor Mayer said without doubt. So then what would I say? I'm not sure. So maybe it's strengthened perhaps. It's a strong perhaps.
So really, thank you for a wonderful and so rich talk. And so convincing. I guess there are many questions.
So I want to turn specifically to conventions of propriety. So in Bamahan, I think not in Dandin, but I might be wrong. There's this one of the extra ones you mentioned, the few subsequent ones. It's a thing called kalpana dushta, where if two words are pronounced together a certain order, you coincidentally produce a bad word.
Yeah.
Is that the reverse word? It is in Dandin. Yeah. But that's this reversed words. That's what this is. That if the two characters occur in a certain order, it produces a bad effect. But if you reverse them, it's okay. Or either way, it's bad.
I think when it's bad, I think in Dandin Gramyata occurs, the two words when they're pronounced together produce those kind of connotations. It's in Dandin as well, in Bama. But there is a category of this Gaupana Dushta. There is one which is somewhat different. Ganda, we talked with Nagaraja Rao. This word Ganda, it's not supposed to be good, right?
Right. Well, I wanted to ask also about the other three. Like, what's the difference between taboo and suggestiveness and tangential reference?
Well, tangential reference, all of them, it's like there are cases where you talk about, something which is inauspicious to the state, to the king, to the parents. We can go to the examples, but then the way in which it is done is different. So this tangential reference, it could be not directly stated. It's like somewhat implied when you read that. So the way of their operation is not the same. But then I think the categories are state, king, parents, and in the Indian case, most of them are
So it's by, but I mean, the division of 15, 16, and 17 is by content, not by sort of mode. Because again, thinking of Bamaha, there are certain words that are bad words. Specifically, and if you use another synonym, it's okay. And there are other things where the meaning is bad. There's Shabda Dushta, Artha Dushta, Kalpana Dushta, which is the sort of restoration kind, and then there's Shruti Kashta, which is actually phonetic, right?
That's the last one, this Ganda thing,
right.
which is different. But then most of them, when I read them, I think that they all have, Gandhan's Gramyata. It all has like sexual connotation. Chinese doesn't talk about this at all. And the Shruti Dushta, what you mentioned, it has nothing to do with the content, just like jarring to the ear. Jarring to the ear.
About Bhamaha's date, I think we can push him even a little earlier. Because, see, in the first half of the 7th century, there was a great teacher called Skanda Swami, and he had two students, one Maheshwara and one Hariswami. This Hariswami, who has written a commentary on Nirukta, he quotes two shlokas from Bhamaha's Kavya Alankara. And we definitely, and his co-student Maheshwara, who has written a commentary on Brihadaranya, not Brihadaranya Upanishad, on another Vedic work, he gives the date of finishing that work. And that is 638. And so these two students who are under the same teacher, they were in about 638. And if by that time Bhamaha had become famous and he had been quoted as an authority, Bhamaha should have been a little earlier. And so he may be even in the last quarter of the 6th century, and so a few years earlier it might be. Just that clarification I want to give.
Great, I think in my conversation with Yigal, you also mentioned the possibility of Bamaha being in the late 6th century.
Yeah, I don't want to get into there's much more we can say about this, and there's conflicting evidence. But yeah, it's definitely possible that Bama was much earlier. Yeah, it's definitely possible.
Yeah, then in that case it would help us even more.
Thanks so much for this talk. It was very interesting to hear, to get this concrete information about the Chinese text. I will just continue. I wanted to remind you of Warder's opinion. He expressed his opinion a long time ago that he considers Bamaha to belong most likely to the 4th, 5th century. And my impression was when I worked between 1997 and 1999 that this is probably correct, and there is certainly a huge time gap between Bamaha and Dandin. And now in this connection, we should not forget when you discuss the probabilities whether Dandin could have been used in China or not. Dandin himself mentions several times that Purva Shastrani Samhritya, and he mentions always the Purvas Suri. So we certainly have a tradition which unfortunately is not available to us, but which was available. So this should not be forgotten. And he himself also says that he just gives the gist of it, the bija of it. So we have a tradition which is simply not available as a text. And I can't believe that it is Bamaha. Bamaha doesn't fit in this pattern, at least judging on the information which you so kindly provided. And one last note on the on this Yamaka, which you designated as samstrishti. I'm not aware of this term. I haven't come across this term. At least Ratna defines this as sambinna just because it's a hodgepodge of various different yamakas, and there is just a very clear definition what we find in this samsrishti yamaka. It's just at the end of all the yamakas because it's a mixture of several kinds of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. So I think I think maybe I'm too single-pointedly focused on looking for evidence of Dandin. So if there's a predecessor of Dandin, doesn't help us too much. But then I think in terms of working with this evidence, I guess it allows more opportunity for the Sanskrit influence on China. It's like that's a very good point. And in terms of Samsrishti, I think I took that, probably it's not in Kavyadasha, I took it from Epling. So it's a mixture. I guess the word itself means mixture, but does it occur in Kavyadasha?
No, there's no definition.
Okay, yeah.
Actually, I would have
Sorry, but yeah.
Sorry, I guess you have.
Just because I'm not clear, you use the word Kukai writes. Kukai compiles. You think that it was Kukai himself who compiled this treatise, or do you think he obtained it in China and just brought it to Japan?
Well, there is a place. I think the text itself mentioned that he was requested by a. There's different kinds of interpretation where it could be many people, or it could also be a youngster. It was requested by a youngster, or it would be maybe a bunch of them. And then, it's quite. Certainly, it's an anthology. He put these texts together. So I think he's a compiler. So writing, maybe if I used it, it's not correct. So then it's. Basically, he compiled these texts together. But then I think there is a question of, how much role do you give to Kukai? So if you look at these Japanese and Chinese scholarship, it seems like he wrote nothing almost. Or at least, the sections I worked on, it seems like they say, well, there is this description of Yamaka. From here to here is Cuirong, from here to here is Yuanqing. It's like he did nothing, just put these materials together. So there's a question of how much, what kind of role he has in it. But certainly, in general, we would say he's a compiler, put these things together. And then how much role you want to give to him, I think it's something which probably requires a lot of effort to, to go into all these textual materials.
What I have to say is whether we actually were in a kind of a witch hunt. Because I think we were looking for parallels that we have certain things in Sanskrit and we are trying to find the same things in Chinese. But I have been in China for at least 1 year and I translated this book by Hajime Nakamura ways of thinking of the Eastern peoples. And also I tried to translate some Chinese poems into Sinhala. So my general impression is that the Chinese are not looking for parallels, but alternatives. Now, in their exercises, Chinese exercise system also, you are not doing physical exercises, giving the developing of your physical thing, but you are trying to control the breathing system so that your nervous system will function properly, and that is the alternative. So I think and also in their sports, like in shooting, they don't teach you to shoot the normal way we handle the bow and arrow. They will turn back like that and shoot. Back like this and shoot. So from all this, what I understood is, you should not go for parallels and equals. This is Yamaka, this is Yamaka. I think what you should go for is alternatives. In the sense, look for shleshas, look for vakroktis. I think by that way, I think you can, because they always have a different way of looking at things. For example, I invited a family for dinner, a few families for the dinner, and one person, he said yes, sometimes he said no. Then when I told him the third time, he said yes. Then I asked him why. You have to invite at least 3 times. Then only we take it seriously. So this is the way. And in I think these 3 kingdoms, there is a war. And how sometimes the person he goes in a boat to which he has a lot of hay, right around in the boat, and goes with lights into the enemy territory. Then people are surprised, why, what is he doing? Then he went, and when they saw this boat coming, they started to shoot. All the arrows got stuck in the hay, and he comes back with so many arms, which is useful for them to fight against them. So this alternative way of thinking is the way of thinking of Chinese. So I think, this of course, because I didn't learn Chinese as such, but the way how they work is looking for alternatives. So go for alternatives. I think Shlesha and Vakrokti would be a better field for investigation.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate being able to hear your comment on it. I'm myself, I guess, just a methodological note. I feel I'm also like too single-pointedly focusing on looking for parallel. Maybe it's, so what if you find it's a parallel? So there are alternative ways of thinking. Been thinking about perhaps even the advantage of doing comparison. Perhaps in some ways it could be joined with that. But I certainly will keep in my mind what you said about looking for alternative ways of thinking.
Also, one more thing. If you study their calligraphy, you can see how sophisticated that it has become. So that they have persons called grandmasters. It is not very easy for anybody else from any tradition to become a grandmaster. So they have a very sharp way of identifying anyone who is not from that group. One may draw so many things, which are very similar to it, and for example, we really don't be able to discover any difference. But the grandmaster will say, oh no, this is not our tradition. So they are very peculiar about these things. And I personally think there might have been, they may have all the time grandmaster tradition, even in poetry, because it is calligraphy is also a form of writing, and poetry also you write. And as I can remember, in one instance, a poet called Taboo comes out after a few
Can we allow a few more people to answer this? So I've four more people. Andrew, Elisa, Charlie, and I want to say something too. Okay.
Thank you, Shenghai. This is extremely informative and very rich, and I'm wondering when we can start putting some of the pieces together, and I'm thinking about what is the process, or what are we looking for, and what types of conclusions do we want to make. And I want to summarize what I think to be the salient points. The Kavyadasha is a Shastra. According to Victor, there are very few people in this world who are reading Sanskrit. There's something about reading Shastra in Sanskrit that you can't do it if you're not reading Sanskrit. Now, there's also the lack of smoking guns, even the lack of a kind of basic vocabulary, what Yagal called the calling card of Sanskrit poetics, of alankaras. This is very troubling to me, and I think that when we look at the similarities, especially the similarities that you're saying have existed many, many years, centuries before we know that there was Indian influence in China, this also seems to me to suggest that if there is a borrowing, it's a conceptual, it's along the terms that you stated. A third point, this is not kind of Alankara Shastra in Shakespeare, as we were talking about last night. This is a culture that had a massive, huge project, very systematic project of borrowing Indian knowledge, translating Indian knowledge from a relatively early point. But that point, as you have both said, is hundreds of years before Dandin at least, and probably also before Pamaha. So when we have poetics and this is an extremely interesting instance of poetics in this culture. It's trying to articulate its principles. They might actually be articulating the principles of kavya, but kavya that doesn't recognize itself to be kavya. And so I think that this is something that we should also keep in mind. I'm not sure how exactly we think about this. We don't need to think about it in terms of, let's try to see if we can fit Sanskrit Alankara Shastra terms onto this tradition of poetics, because it's a kind of kavya at several degrees of remove. So, I mean, I guess I don't have a question, but I wanted to kind of, the case for borrowing seems in every respect, at least when we're talking about Bhama and Dandin, to be extremely weak. So, but I don't think that that we can't ask interesting questions about poetics working itself out and its relationship to Indian poetics. So I just wanted to think about reframing those questions.
That's right. Well, I think certainly, along the same line that you're speaking, certainly I would say one thing, there's not too much of evidence that, Alankara has influenced the concept, the whole theoretical tradition of Alankara Shastra has well, first of all, I guess Alankara itself, there's not too much evidence. I think all languages, these highly developed poetry, analogy, imagination, all of them, when you look for them, of course, you can find them. So there's no evidence of systematic articulation of Indian-style Alankara. We go to the earlier 5th century Liu Xie's Wenxing Diaolong, which is the literary mind and carving of a dragon. There you find maybe 5-6 analogies, metaphors. And in later Song dynasty, there's a list of 10 analogies. But analogies all literature have. So, and then when you look at those lists, they are very different. So, I have to say that I have not found any evidence of this Indian notion of Alankara. If you have a list of 8 of them piled up together, then you say that this is quite sure. But you have nothing of this sort, that's for sure. And then in terms of Kavya itself, we're talking about, of course, Chinese poetry. We have poetry. Then in terms of Indian-style Kavya, how many of them are in Chinese? If you think about the ones that are really considered as sort of high style, I think there are just about 3. Buddhacharita, translation, Buddhacharita, Shata Panchashataka, and then Jataka Mala. All of them, when you look at them, they're actually, in the process of translation, there is loss in the conveying of these Alankaras. So I would say, giving all of this, whatever evidence we can present, it's not going to be very strong. You cannot say that this proves it. Certainly, nothing even close to that. So the project itself is looking for these evidence. That's the best I can do here. So I do agree with you that this maybe it's not the most productive way. So we just want to get to the conclusion. Yes, he's there. Yes, he is probably 69% of chance that he's there. So, this kind of conclusion is maybe not productive. When I read it, it's like I see the possibility of doing comparison. That is, it's like retrieving the richness of the tradition. Perhaps it will do a better job. But I think, in terms of, this is my project, so I want to get to a certain kind of conclusion. I would say these are the evidence. If you want evidence, that's what it is. And then I think it's up to everyone else to look for, to make their conclusion. Some of them might say, yes, it's very unique, very strong. And some people would say, maybe not so.
Yes, thank you for opening up this completely new world for me. I just wanted to add that there is a tendency nowadays to put the date of the Natya Shastra a little bit forward, like 4th, 5th century. Mm-hmm. But of course, there are enormous textual problems. But so, I wouldn't rule out the possibility of an influence of the Natya Shastra on the basis of dates. Yeah. And in the Natya Shastra, of course, you have doshas, gunas, and you have, I think, 4 alankaras. And yamaka. Yamaka is one of them. Yeah. And you have like 10 types, 10 doshas, I think. And you have examples, so it might be maybe useful also to look into these examples. Yeah. And I was wondering, in connection to this, if the Natya Shastra would be a possible source. So why you don't? In this cultural transmission, you don't take the whole package of dramatic art. And if the fact that there is no maybe dramatic art in China so early could be enough of an argument to just take, a part of the Natya Shastra and leave out everything else. And if you have some thoughts about this.
Sure. I looked at the list of doshas and yamakas briefly, and a lot of them are kind of similar to what Bhamaha already had. I didn't look at the text very closely, but just looking at the types of things that's available. The reason I think is I feel the Chinese reception of Indian traditions is somewhat very different. It really takes up to the time of, I would say, 6th, 7th century when it becomes very mature. The knowledge of India becomes very, very strong. And I think at that point, looking for the type of evidence, I thought those Chinese or at least when they're in their encounter with Indian monks, I think at that point in the 6th, 7th century, they are most mature to receive this kind of influence. That's what that's the reason why I chose to focus on Dandin and Bhamaha. But certainly, I could take a more close look at them. But my impression is it's somewhat similar. It's not really adding much more. Like there's not going to be changing the general conclusion.
It may be that, unlike Xuanzang's journey to the West, our journey to the east, we don't come back with any texts of Dandin from China. But that doesn't mean that this journey doesn't teach us something about how to read Dandin. What I think is really important, we're talking about China and Dandin, but it's really what we have here is Kukai. And to just remind ourselves, Kukai is a ritual master, and he's interested in ritual. And David Schulman has been reminding us of the work of Don Handelman on ritual and then on riddles and prahelikas and their nature. It doesn't seem that any accident then that it's yamakas that's some of the strongest evidence that Kukai is taking up. And then the general lesson that Don Handelman is kind of challenging us is that things like ritual and things like riddles and things like poetry, perhaps itself, are somehow internally kind of structured in such a way that they resist being caught up in kind of the expressive realism of power and politics and so on, that they have a different rhythm that's going on. That may be a really big general lesson that comes from going and finding at the end of this road is Kukai. That it makes us think about India in a completely different way, or reminds us things that we've known, but we, let's sit to the side of, oh, this is an important lesson.
I just wanted to first to thank Shenghai, which I think you made a real discovery here about the way, and I think you actually did what P.B. Mingaskumara suggested that you do, which is you looked for alternatives. You didn't look for the simple parallels, but you looked for something that did not suggest itself as a parallel on the face of it, and you showed us something very interesting on the way, and I think it's a real discovery, on the way this kind of vocabulary of analysis of Yamaka, Vyapeta, Adimadyanta, Samsrishti, these kinds of things, Pratiloma, is applicable to something that's slightly different and may have existed in China, but may have come and added itself to literary theory in China. And I think that's a very important discovery and very interesting and very powerfully presented. I want to say something about more general, kind of zooming out from these details about these whole afternoon fascinating panel. We only have two very extremely different cases here. The case of Tibet and Mongolia on the one hand, and the case of China, Japan on the other hand. In one case we have a place where Dandin was repeatedly translated, commented upon, became a text that was at the heart of high cultured civilization in both these countries. Every conversation started and maybe even still starts in a way with a trace of Dandin. It's just amazing influence, amazing presence, amazing continued longevity, vitality, whatever you want. Then we have a case where it is clear that there was some kind of negotiation with important aspects of Indian culture, maybe some aspects of fiction, of certain story elements, maybe some aspects of poetic theory, but in a very tangential way. There's no translation of Dandin for sure. There's no commentary on Dandin. There's no known manuscript of Dandin from the older period. So very distinct cases, and that's okay. I mean, we're not. That is the interesting. The difference is interesting. We're talking about differences, and we're talking about the different profusion. And I think one thing that came up in our conversation is very important. That came in the conversation between something that Vesna and Pema and Janet and Dragomir and Victor are all saying, is the difference between, and Whitney and other people, the difference between Sanskrit learning in these different regions, and the Sanskrit scholarship. Okay, there is maybe some kind of wall surrounding Sanskrit Shastra, as far as Sanskrit Shastra is concerned, and that there less scholars, less scholars reading Sanskrit constantly in China than there are in Tibet and in Mongolia. And that is one important factor. There may be other important factors. We need to start in making these lists of important factors. The differences here are fascinating. So we didn't find Dandin there. Okay, I'm not at all upset. It's not the purpose of the project. Despite having incurred the bad karma of leading people to think that it is. What is interesting is to see the test cases and the limits of the Dandin hypothesis, and these two extreme examples that we bunched together for this afternoon present fascinating differences that will echo very interestingly with the Southeast Asian and the Burma examples. I'm sure in the continuation of our talk, workshop. Yes.
I just want not to leave the wrong impression that historically not so many Tibetans read Sanskrit either. So that's not the case. Mm-hmm. They translated it and then they did it all in Tibetan. Just minor point. I don't want to give that impression.
Yeah. So I'm chair. I must speak. No. So I just want to say that, in fact, just to strengthen your case and Victor's, in fact, Kukai did know Sanskrit.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he does.
So, I mean, Kukai is one person. Chinese poetry is one thing. It's a long tradition. But I think that you are very convincing in the idea that Kukai might have applied Sanskrit poetic theory to the existing, I mean, the categorization in Sanskrit term seems to me very convincing. And at least he did know, I mean, he and his Chinese teachers. But anyway, I think we are finished, yeah? So thank you for a wonderful session. Thank you all the